All right. Well, hello, everyone, and welcome to this installment of the Metaversial Minute, where we continue to tilt at the slings and arrows and possibilities of creating a metaverse, virtual worlds, as we're going to discuss today. I'm really pleased to have my guest today, Dr. Richard Bartle. Although he's only recently, I think, over the last couple of years, aware of me as I drew him into my social media circles, and we've had this social media conversation happening. He has had a big influence on my career, going all the way back to um, this book, Designing Virtual Worlds, which came out, I think, 2004, right after the turn of the century, or the millennium,
Yes,
we'll
yes, it
say.
was a pre-World of Warcraft.
Right. So right around that time, and when Lockheed Martin bought my company in 2007, I got these as many as I can get, and it does say this is the New Writers on-demand reprint. So we got as many of these as we could, and passed them around as the Bibles to my virtual world labs group within Lockheed Martin. But I'm really intrigued also by your recent book, How to Be a God, and we're going to talk about how to be a god in the metaverse today, among a variety of other topics. But Dr. Bartle, if you could just sort of introduce yourself and say a little about what drew you into this intellectual pursuit so early of designing virtual worlds.
Okay, hello everybody. I'm Richard Bartle. Honorary Professor of Computer Game Design at the University of Essex in the UK, hence the accent. I've been working in virtual worlds from the very beginning because I co-wrote the first one, which was called MUD, Multi-User Dungeon, with a friend of mine at the University of Essex, Roy Trubshaw. He was actually the lead. I was the person he handed it over to after he decided he maybe ought to leave the university and get a job after graduating. So I've been in it for a long time, but before then, I was always interested in games, and I was always interested in creating worlds. So it wasn't that I was drawn to the industry. It's just that was my trajectory. I wanted to make worlds. I wanted to create systems that would I could watch, not like a formicarium, but more of a just how would that look? Just wouldn't it be great? Just that's amazing. This is what I wanted. I just wanted to be able to create, just imagine what it would be like. It would be fantastic, and that's how I progressed. I started with making board games, making my own role-playing games before Dungeons and Dragons had reached these shores. But mine was only a single-player role-playing game, so not really.
What was the name of it?
It was called The Adventures of Dr. Toddystone.
Okay,
well, what I did was I took these little pieces of paper. They were about, I don't know, 7 by 9 inches. And I bought a pad of about 140 of them, and I stuck them together with sticky tape, turned them over because you can't use felt tips on sticky tape. And then I drew a map. And as I was drawing the map, I'd be adding features, coast things. And it was a map of an undiscovered continent. And I would add native tribes and volcanoes and rivers and mosquito-infested swamps and all sorts of things I'd add. And then I'd start off at one side, and I made a pair of protractors. I got 2 pins, stuck them together with sellotape, so they were 30 millimeters apart. And then I made it. I put a pin in and then moved it, and that anything within that range was where Dr. Toddystone would go, and I recorded his movements. But the point of it was that I wrote down a diary. So I recorded a diary of everything that he's done. And that was the game. It was the writing the diary. That's what made it role playing.
There was a narrative. There was a narrative that was created around it.
Yeah. And but when you read it afterwards, it was dead on the page. I mean, it was only the writing of it that was exciting. That was the play. Reading it afterwards is you're not there. You had to be there.
Yeah, I think one of the things that struck me about the first book I read of yours was the the eloquent description of the difference between, because again, when you were doing the multi-user dungeons and those sort of text-based narrative experiences, you're using the substrate of the mind as the sub-reality. You talk about our real reality with a capital R, and all the sub-realities we create. And of course, that's what we do when we read a novel or watch a movie. We create these sort of worlds within our imaginations. And there was this period of time where we really couldn't bridge. There was a chasm, that we needed to cross, of going from those text-based narratives and the rich worlds we could create inside of our minds to actually being able to portray them on a computer. Because initially they were 2D, and it wasn't until we could really get into sort of deep 3D experiences in the computer that we started realizing, like, this is a completely different medium. Do you remember the first sort of online 3D game experience that struck you as like, wow, we're finally getting there?
No. Well, I mean, I do. That's because none of them have ever done that. Not because I don't remember back in the day. No. I always found text more immersive than graphics. Graphics, yeah, they're great. 60% of all the information you get in your life comes through your eyes.
Right.
For most people, and obviously some people can't see, but for the creation of the world, the world that you're building is in your head, and images can make you build things very quickly because we've got all these millions of years of evolution that's given us a brain that will do that, but it won't give you everything, and it doesn't make you. Text is more immersive if you have an imagination, if you're and you're willing to use it. The graphical worlds that we have, yeah, they're great. I play them, and I've got nothing against them. It's just that none of them have made me ever say, "Wow!" Even the 3D VR.
That's very interesting because I was mentioning, like, in my background, I've got pictures of Tom Clancy and Michael Crichton, and I remember when we were first talking with them about making games out of their their novels. At the time, their representatives from the agencies that were representing them said, "Look, no one has ever yet successfully translated a novel into a game concept. Movies, fine, because they follow that sort of linear narrative and story arc that you talk about in your books. And the challenge in a game is, like, especially when you get into massively multiplayer online games, is that it's non-linear and you can go in so many directions. And how do you take the sort of intent of the author creating this narrative arc and put it into a non-linear world? That was a huge challenge. And we were one of the first to actually achieve that. And the real key for that was, and I always talk about the difference between these two gentlemen here, is Tom Clancy said, "Look, I know nothing about gaming. I'll give you access to the FBI hostage rescue team. Here's my novel." And he actually was writing the novel Rainbow Six at the same time we were making the game. But we were free to use all of our knowledge and care about game mechanics and these nonlinear narratives to create worlds that way, and therefore it was really successful. Contrast that with Michael Crichton, who was writing a book called Timeline about time travel back to 14th century France, and he actually said, "No, I want to be hands-on. I want final creative control. I'm going to make all of the major decisions in the game." That one not as successful because he was trying to map it back to the linear narrative. So that linear versus non-linear, I think, is really compelling, but it also creates, and that's why we need books like yours that help people understand, like, how to be a god, how to design with this medium, which is unlike in many ways a lot of other media types. So you mentioned,
well, yes, it is. It's sorry, you carry on.
No, I was just thinking, I pulled this little thing out to impress you, that I read about the Kostler, if I'm saying it right, the Kostler-Vogel cube, the storytelling cube that was created to help people who are creating understand all of those components.
Yeah.
But talk a bit about the differences.
Yeah, well, Ralph Koster is a major figure in, probably a preeminent figure in virtual world design. So if you want him on your program, he's certainly got a lot to say about the metaverse. Not all of it favorable, but not all of it unfavorable.
We're definitely trying to show all sides. So yes, feel free to say anything negative you'd like about it too. Yeah, its direction.
Yeah. Well, in terms of story, yes. The thing about story is that when you play a game, you don't want the story, you want your story. And when you interact with the game systems, you're creating events, and from those events that you create, some of them will be meaningful to you, not necessarily to other people, and some of them will be meaningless to you, but other people might find them important. And from those events, you select the ones that are meaningful to you, and those have got causalities between them, which create when you relate it, you're telling a story. So as you're telling somebody else, this is what happened, these are these events, wasn't it fantastic when this happened, when we did this, I almost, and those events that you're telling are important to you, but they've emerged from the game system, the game systems that you've been interacting with. Now, you can overlay that with a plot structure to make sure that players have always got some direction to go narratively. And the plot structure doesn't have to be down at the individual level. I mean, it can have of each individual event, but it can have points you have to go through, plot points you have to go through, and then string of pearls around it. And so this is why games are, they're not stories, but they're machines for creating stories. And if you try and shoehorn a game into a story, well, you're just watching cutscenes and then fighting or whatever between the cutscenes. But if you're allowing the story to emerge, then you're saying, look, there are stories here, there are many stories here, and I may have wasted my time by writing some that you'll never encounter. But the ones that you do encounter, you will decide whether they're important or not to you. And that means they'll be more meaningful to you because you selected them. And that's why at the end of the game, it's your story. When you say what happened in that game, you'd relate the major points. Some of them will have been scripted, some of them won't have been scripted. And this is one of game's strengths. It's that it allows the reader to hone the story for what they want. But one of the problems games have, the graphical games, is that there are limits on the assets that you can have at the moment. In the future, there won't be, but at the moment, there are limits on the assets. And what you're presented with may not be meaningful to you as it is to someone else. So if you see a particular shadowy shape looming through a forest and think, oh dear, that looks like a giant spider. Well, for some people, they're going to be freaked out by giant spiders, but you might not be. Or you might be freaked out by hairy ones, but not shiny ones. Or you might be freaked out by ones that are completely black, or ones that have got all these different multicolors on them. So if you're playing a text game, then you put whichever was appropriate for you into that slot. Yeah. But if you're playing a graphical game at the moment, because we can't change the graphics on the fly for individuals, you're stuck with what that is the artist created. And the artist might be much better at imagining scary spiders than you, in which case that's great. But if they're not, then it could flop when it's supposed to be tense.
Interesting. So yeah, you're talking about the assets in these worlds. One of the most compelling assets especially in a massively multiplayer online world are the non-player characters. And you talk about that a lot in both your books that I'm reading or have read. And so I want to talk about this sort of trajectory of the development of non-player characters over time. When we were first doing games, I remember our game designer saying, the most compelling thing you can encounter in a game is actually another real person. That's when we tried to get into Rainbow Six and making it multiplayer. as well as other games we created. But until we could really achieve that, we were trying to make our non-player characters as convincing as possible. And we had some pretty crude tools initially, but I recall the first game where we all got spooked by our own creation was a game we created called Ghost Recon, where the AI started outsmarting us, and we had to go to figure out how to hamper it, how to limit it in some ways, because a human couldn't compete with it. But how are you seeing the evolution of NPCs, and where do you see it going?
Well, I had that same problem that you had when I was doing it in mud. I had to dumb down the enemies because otherwise they were beating the players. In time, we will be able to create non-player characters who are as intelligent as or more intelligent than we are. And when I say in time, just take as many years as you want, millions of years, hundreds of millions of years, you've got eternity. So we will eventually get them. Now, as you can ask, what do we do once we've got them? Or you can ask, should we start trying to make them in the first place? Well, we're going to get them anyway, regardless. Someone will make them. If not on our planet, then on another one. And what are our responsibilities towards them? Now, in actual practical terms, how close are we at the moment? Well, for some non-player characters, they're completely convincing at the moment because they don't do anything. All they do, you don't need an AI behind a guard on a city wall, because the guard's just going to walk up and down the wall until he gets shot or she gets shot. And that's their job. And they don't need to have it. If actually gave them AI and then set them up to be shot down, then well, it's kind of cruel, isn't it, really, if they've got thinking capabilities. So for some perfectly mundane things, that's fine. The more interesting parts are when we've got characters with AI and they are able to interact with one another to create their own goals and their own requirements, which players can then satisfy. So instead of having to write a plot, well, you can still do that, but you might say, okay, so I've got this particular non-player character whose job is working in a shoe shop making shoes, but he's really ambitious and he wants to do more than that, and he wants to set up his own shoe shop. He doesn't have enough money, so he creates the goal of getting money, and then he'll work towards getting money, and that might be through robbery, it might be through borrowing, it could be through anyway, it depends on the individual. And then there'll be somebody else who maybe owns another shoe shop, sees competition, and then thinks, well, I need to stop that. Perhaps they come to the player characters, lie to you and say, this man here has been sleeping with my dog, go and kill him. And this kind of level of interacting goals that emerges from individuals' thinking processes, that's how the real world works at the moment. We don't have anybody plotting our lives for us. Well, maybe Prince Charles, now King Charles did, but for most of us, we don't have a plot. There's no story. What happens is the world is sufficiently richly interactive that through our competing desires for different states of affairs, there's conflict, drama, cooperation, friendship, all the emotions. Now, once we've reached that level of AI, where the player characters, non-player characters can create their own goals and inveigle player characters into it, because they won't know that the player characters aren't themselves non-player characters unless we tell them. Then once we've got to that level, then that makes it a much more interesting world. And you could play in that world, be alone and not realize you were alone, because the non-player characters are acting like player characters would. But whether they would have the same whether they would require the same philosophical structures that we have to our thinking, or whether they're just superficial. Well, that would be another matter. But eventually we will be able to add those things if we want to. We will be able to give them self-reflection, self-doubt, have them sitting around trying to figure out what other people are doing and then changing themselves accordingly. All this that we can do. There's also, sorry.
I was thinking about that trajectory. I mean, for those of you who are thinking about how to be a god and you're designing these non-player characters, I recall like in the 90s, we were doing, it was simple behavior trees. It was evasion, it was pathfinding, that kind of thing. So like you said, if you run into an enemy, you either fire or you try to attack that enemy or you run away. Then we got to where I think most games are today, which is hierarchical behavior trees, where the behaviors can change based on state or what reputation level you have with that faction or whatever. But what you're talking about now is non-player characters who can set their own goals, and we possibly, unless we constrain what those goal sets might be, they could surprise us with goals that have nothing to do with the game potentially. And that's where, and now we're starting to use machine learning, right? So if you have a system that can evolve itself and self-improve, man, if we couldn't even play against a non-player character in when was that, 2001, how can we prevail against a sort of evolving, improving non-player character in 2022? Hopefully they're helping us, not fighting against us.
Well, yes. If you restrict them to the virtual world so that they can't do anything to the real world, they're in a sandbox, and doesn't matter how smart they are, they're not killer robots, they can't escape, then we're okay. Unless, well, I suppose if they're so smart that they can manipulate humans into doing things for them, then that would be different. But
what was that book, Daniel Suarez's Daemon? Have you read that? Daniel, I think it's Suarez, but that he has this game system that basically escaped the game, the AI, and starts manipulating the real world to bad effect. So it makes for a good.
Yes, it's always to bad effect. Yeah. Well, the way that games AI works at the moment, it's the reason it uses behavior trees is because essentially it's got very little time to make decisions. You've only got a few milliseconds of budget to spend, so that's what you have to do, things very quickly. There's a Monte Carlo tree search method that can help with strategy games because it gives you a good idea, and the more time you spend on it, then the better your idea is. But even if you've got a very small budget, it can make decisions very rapidly, basically just by choosing at random and then seeing which the best way is. But it's still got the same problem of resources. If we had some AI as a service, so your game was talking over the internet to some huge hollowed out mountain full of computers somewhere, then that could be a lot more intelligent than your individual game. And so long as you can just say, here's the parameters, and quickly tell me what to do, and so long as that latency is not so bad, then you've got a possibility of having super smart characters in your home console game. So there are approaches to getting around it, other than just adding more chips to your console or your PC. But the machine learning, one of the things the games researchers, the people who research games in AI, they're all into machine learning. They all want that, but players aren't necessarily pleased by it because they don't like it when the AI learns from their behavior. In part, that's because then they end up not playing the game; they end up playing the AI. So if you're thinking like with the car games with rubber banding, so you race ahead and then the other cars are all chasing behind and speeding up because they see how fast you are and you want to make it feel good. So that's a form of very simple AI. So if you want to win those games, what you can do is train the AI to think you're stupid or a bad driver. Just crawl around slowly, and they're all just up ahead, but they're keeping back because they're learning your play style. And then you get to the final lap, and off you go like a rocket, and they can't catch you because they've all been trained the other way. So you end up having to play to train the AI, and that means you now have to understand how the AI works, and it's quite tedious. It's better if you're learning by trying to beat the system. That's, well, when I say better, it makes the players feel better. Because otherwise, if you're playing a sports game or something and the opponents are watching your tactics and thinking, well, you're playing this particular formation in soccer or whatever, then we'll need to play this formation to counter it. Then after a while, you find that they're all countering it, and then you have to adapt because it's learned from it. Now, for some players, that's interesting and good, and for other players, that's bad because I spent some time mini-maxing this, and now you've come up with a meta that defeats it. Over time, culture will probably change, and we won't mind the AI learning unless the AI is thrashing us every time. So there will eventually be
the game is fun, and when it stops being fun, then you defeat the purpose of the game.
Yeah.
So I'm looking at the subheadline of your book here, where it says a book about philosophy, theology, and computer games, and you do delve into theology and other subjects about which caused me to think about one question for you, which is one that we ask fairly frequently, which is, what do you think the highest moral purpose of having these sort of alternate computer-generated realities might or should be?
Well, the higher moral purpose is, it depends on whose perspective. From the perspective of the AIs that you have created, the higher moral purpose is that they have come into being. So if you ask the non-player characters, then they would, what's the highest moral purpose of your land, of your universe, of your reality? They would be saying, well, it's the fact that it exists. But if you're asking the designer, the person who did it, what's their moral purpose? Well, there are many reasons why you might create a virtual world. The reason I created Mud with Roy Trubshaw was because I didn't like the real world. The real world sucked, and I thought I could do a better job.
All too often falls short, doesn't it?
Yeah, there are some bad design decisions in this world, and I'm not happy with them. I don't like this getting old malarkey. It doesn't suit me. So there are some. That's why I created it. As for what the higher moral purpose is, for me, it's all about the freedom to be and become yourself. That's what I was creating virtual worlds for. It was so that you've got the ability to be who you are. Now, other people would have different reasons. Some people might have no moral purpose, or they might have a purpose which is immoral or amoral to do it, but others might say, well, the higher moral purposes are they could take a religious perspective and say, well, God created us in his image, and if God can create universes, then we should create universes, because then we are following in the steps of being in God's image. So the higher moral purpose of creating this is to glorify God. They could argue that, and that would be perfectly reasonable argument to make. Not one I particularly hold myself, but I'm just giving examples. People might be doing it because they want the moral purpose is to educate, or to teach, or to learn. You might create a a reality in order to learn what would happen in our reality if something went terribly wrong or something went terribly right, or if we made a change to the economy, what would happen. And then the higher moral purpose would be to spare the ill effects, if there were any, on our reality by using the one we created as a test bed. So there are, so the highest, well, it depends on your own morals, really, as to what it's going to be. And for some people, just creating them is immoral because you're bringing into being people who never asked to be brought into being, and then you're making them suffer, and they didn't want to be suffered, and you can stop them from suffering. So you just by creating them, you're doing a bad thing. So some people would say there is no moral purpose in creating intelligent non-player characters. The moral purpose is in not creating them.
All right, let me pitch my dissertation to you. Like I was talking to my colleagues yesterday about talking to you today, and I said, I very much would have liked or would like to be a student of Dr. Bartle. In fact, I kind of already am, as I've already revealed after reading all of your work. But my thesis, if I was to become your student today and join your academic efforts there, is that this is the simulation century. What I think is the last century was about the recorded image. It was the first time in human history when we would review current events or recent events by recording footage of them, like the Vietnam War or whatever was happening. And Marshall McLuhan would say that medium that we're engaging with actually changes us physically, changes us societally. And I think when I think about the moral purpose of this medium, it's the idea of like, how do we actually model future forms of our own civilization, of our own cities, of our environments, and actually look at ideas like here in the US. I don't know, hopefully you're probably not paying too much attention to what we're doing here, but as we're passing these laws around Build Back Better and Inflation Reduction Act and Green Energy Acts, where we're trying to think and explain to people, here's how your city will be. Let me help manifest the ideas around these new policies, and let's look at the impact of these decisions, either the bad ones, but the bad and the good, on what our cities, our communities will look like in the future, based on these. So when I was in high school, I would read, I was really drawn for some weird reason to like Sir Thomas More's Utopia, and reading that, like, just the best forms of community, or Edward Bellamy's Looking Backward. And now I think about how do we actually design and then use that as a model and try to build towards these better ideas.
Well,
so what would you say if I came and proposed that and said, I want to write a dissertation or a book on that and do research on it?
Well, yeah, I mean, I'd be happy to take you on as a PhD student for that. Yeah, my undergraduates aren't particularly interested in being taught by me or anyone else, really.
Well, they're missing out then.
Yeah, some of them are very good, but a lot of them are doing computer games because I don't teach programming in my modules. But for your thesis, that's a valid argument. One of the problems we have in academia is actually demonstrating things. So for things like computer games, you say you want believable, convincing characters. Academics want that. As soon as you start on it, then it's what's your definition of believable? How are we going to measure believable? And then before you know it, you're ending up having to run some survey and get 50 people to tell you whether something's believable or not. And then it turns out that the same thing is believable to some and disbelievable to others, and they all disagree. And then you're lost. At least the games industry doesn't have to bother about that. It just has to say, we want it to be believable. We think this is, and oh, look, we're selling more copies.
Yeah, you're just measuring engagement. Yeah.
Yeah. But so for a thesis, you need to be thinking, well, how am I going to, I'm proposing my thesis, but how am I going to support it? How am I going to demonstrate that it's that it works, and that would be the main issue with it. But as to the substance of it, well, the thing about the word simulation is it seems so it's what are you simulating? And I wouldn't call something like, you know, a virtual world such as Final Fantasy 14 or World of Warcraft or Mud, as I wouldn't say that that was a simulation, because he isn't actually simulating anything other than an imaginary environment. For me, simulations are a bit more tied to reality. So you're simulating something in reality. Now, for something like what would the effect of these laws have on this city, that would be a simulation, that would be fine. But from a game's point of view, which is where I'm coming from in U2, it's less simulation and more well, it's a reality. They're sub-realities of our reality, and they're not simulating anything other than themselves. They define themselves in that they are what they are, rather than abstractions of what something else is. But on the whole, yes, creating systems that you can visit as an individual and immerse yourself in and spend time in as if it was a reality would work. Ooh, what's this?
Yeah, so this is one of the ideas that I almost got fired at Lockheed Martin for doing this, but I encountered this gentleman who was an SES at the Pentagon, who was in charge of he was director of training readiness and strategy for the Undersecretary of Defense. And the idea that he had, after he and I actually met with this Marine general named General Mattis here, who said, why don't we have running simulations of the Ukraine and of, you know, the 14 hotspots around the world with all of the, and that when I say a simulation, it's not high fidelity visual game based thing. It's more like all of the what they would call dime and Pamisi effects of
it's a model basically.
Yeah. So for example, when I was at Lockheed, we would model Afghanistan and all of the people within it, and we would have all these agent based models, and we didn't have machine learning at the time. But still, we didn't have these simplified, you know, non-player characters. We had rich agent-based models that represented all the values, traditions, cultural beliefs, and whatever of the predominant people that lived in an area. So you could literally go in and say, based on the, you know, this understandably, you know, sort of limited simulation, if I build a school for girls in Helmand province, which groups of people are going to be okay with it, which are going to be neutral, and which groups are going to be so angry about it, they're going to go and burn down the school and shoot Malala, right? So that kind of sim is what we were talking about, but doing it on a larger scale. So that's why I have that image of the planet there. His vision, Frank DiGiovanni, we call him D9, his vision was, let's build a simulated world that runs all the time with all those dime and Pamisi, I forget all the acronyms for that, but it's like the political and economic and social infrastructure, all these factors that drive a community or a country running all the time with the terrain and everything, and where you could go in and test, like, what, you know, if Vladimir Putin had this, he would say, what if we do this invasion of the Crimea? What's likely to happen based on our simulation? And with some Monte Carlo sort of distribution of outcomes. And then what if we actually invade the rest of Ukraine? What's likely to happen? And his sim should have told him that based on really good, accurate Diamond Pamisi models, that would have been a bad idea. But so that's one of the ideas I have is trying to build these models. So we'd created something called the virtual world framework, which at the time he was looking for an answer to this, and everybody was showing up, all the usual suspects and the Beltway bandits in DC showing up saying, here's our game engine, please accept it as your standard. We said, well, the real thing doesn't exist yet, but it's going to be the internet. Let's just use WebGL and use JavaScript and build these worlds just in the just there. And we open sourced it, which is the thing that almost got me fired at Lockheed. But that's the sort of thing that I'm trying to do with what remains of my, you know, career.
Well, yes, if you have a model of the world, and the model is constantly being updated as new information comes in and being tweaked so that what the model says reflects what's actually happening. And it may be the model's going in one direction and you have to keep correcting it because you don't know why it's going in that direction and things like that. But as long as you've got one of those, then yes, it shouldn't be too difficult to fork it and say, right, from this point here, what happens if we do this, and then see what the outcome's going to be. Because even though, yeah, there's a lot of chaos there, and we have hard enough trouble predicting the weather, let alone predicting what people will do. Nevertheless, you do know roughly what the best and the worst situations are going to be with what percentages. So yeah, that would be a good way to do things. Then your only question then is, how do you act on that? And are you looking for long-term or short-term? Because things that are short-term, like how do I get elected, isn't necessarily as good as things for the long term, which is how do we ensure that we've got a stable, rich, happy, well-fed society in the future. So if you have the simulations, then they're tools, and how you use the tools is then becomes key. And if the tools themselves are looking at who's programmed them and are trying to avoid themselves from being used to set up something terrible, then you've suddenly got a nice reflective AI there.
I mean, these complex models, though, in the form of games can be really useful, at least in my experience. I know you mentioned you refer to people like Rob and Rand Miller in your book, your books, so the guys who did Myst, and we met them also back in those days and talked about how do we make Myst in 3D, and ultimately we said, well, at that time especially, we can't improve upon what you did with HyperCard in 3D. But then folks like Will Wright and Jeff Braun, who did from Maxis, who did SimCity, I remember playing with those ideas and really getting into the concepts of like, how do you keep a population of people content and happy, and what are the best methods for governing and managing and making those models more rich, I think is a really compelling and interesting opportunity, although they're already getting rich in the in the gaming environment. So one of the other questions I had, and we can't end on this one because it's sort of negative, but what do you see is when we look at the conceptions today of the metaverse and how people are spending more of their time in these sub-realities, as you call them, what are the sort of pitfalls and drawbacks and things that we need to be watching out for as more of our populations spend time in these virtual worlds?
Well, they're the same as for if they're spending their times in pockets of the real world. There are obvious dangers. If a group of people who are getting together in a virtual world making plans to do things in the real world, which the rest of the world wouldn't really like, then obviously that's an issue. Most of the people who are there are just doing it because they've got friends in there. The people they met, the society, the culture, the community is why they're playing. And yes, they go in every day and they play 2 to 4 hours instead of watching television like they should. But whether the effects of playing games are worse or better than watching television really depends on the games and television that you're playing or watching. Also, there aren't. When we started with Mud, we were expecting there to be lots of virtual worlds, so you could pick and choose the ones that you liked and were best. But the trouble is that they cost so much to make that there's actually only a limited number of them at the moment that you can try, and because they're expensive, there's a reluctance to invest in new ideas, because what if you lose all your $30 million? Yeah, but you could make $1 billion. Yeah, but I could lose 30 million. So that's holding them back at the moment, and pretty well treading water until we get to a situation where the tools are such that people will be able to create them, a virtual world, as easily as they could create a text world back in the day. But once we've got to that state where the tools and the assets are all available, then it will be different, because people will be able to create realities that are meaningful for other people from across the world, across the real world, with particular interests, particular mutual interests. If those mutual interests are bad, well, then you're looking at the same as ordinary social media's bad effects. You will get groups of people who believe all sorts of crazy conspiracy theories, and you will find them sitting around there talking. But really, in a virtual world, you've got to do things within the world. There's no point in playing it if you're just going to chat, because you can chat anyway. These days, chat rooms, you don't need a virtual world when you can do it in Facebook or Roblox or anything else. So the idea of virtual worlds being somehow subversive to reality, they are, but only because if you see a virtual world is better than reality, then you want to change reality. But if you see reality as a problem anyway and go into a virtual world to figure out how to screw reality over, well, you don't have to do a virtual world for that. You can do it somewhere else.
Right. Yeah, and that's something we have to keep our eye on is the virtual world as escape, but also there's the privacy issues that occur there, especially with children. And people don't realize that. I think that in these virtual worlds, especially in games, and this is one of the opportunities in education, is we really can track so much information. When I drop an army person into a virtual world like I've created in the past and said, set up that radar dish in the desert, I know immediately how confident they are, what they do, are they reaching, and it's completely nonlinear. It's not a, do you do A, B, C, or D kind of test. It's, I've dropped you into the world. There's the new piece of equipment, unbox it and go through the 37-step process for correctly setting it up and operating it. I'm tracking where their eyes are, how long it takes them between steps. So I have this tremendous amount of information that today's education system, even today, after I've been doing this for 20 years, the learning management systems can't even actively track all of the dimensions of what we see in a game. That we're looking at mouse clicks and where the eyes are going and how long it takes between steps. Did they turn in the right direction? They don't even know how to track that with LMSs. So lots of opportunities, but also the peril of all of that surveillance and tracking, which hopefully we can bend towards more benevolence. So the last one is, who are, well, you can answer either one of these. I'll give you a multiple choice way to finish up. Either, I get all the time because of the background in gaming, I get parents coming to me saying, my child wants to go into gaming. Which major should they have, or what do you recommend they do? And I have some interesting answers to that, and it's not ever what people expect. But also, who will be the gods of the metaverse in the next 5 years? So you can answer either one of those questions.
Well, they are related, as you have, as you know. Well, the gods are the people who control the physics, and for a metaverse, it's pretty much the same as who are the gods of the internet, who controls the equivalent. And the equivalent of a metaverse on the metaverse is the same as the internet, but with 3D and with VR and AR to draw it into reality. But basically, that's the equivalent. It's an interface difference from the internet, but otherwise they're the same basic concepts. So whoever controls the websites and the social sites at the moment, that's the kind of people who will control the metaverse. So there'll be some big players, but there'll be lots and lots of little players, and there'll be bespoke players, and there'll be people who have their own little world and nobody ever visits it. If we have a metaverse controlled by one company, well, that's not going to work out any more than back before the internet, when we had CompuServe, Prodigy, Delphi, Genie, or they were
or 3 broadcast channels on television.
Yeah. There's always the pressure for more, and if one company controls it all, then something else will come out and change it, and it'll happen anyway, because no way is China going to let Facebook own the metaverse, for example, or Apple or anybody else, Microsoft or Amazon. Now, as for how to get, if you're a games, if somebody wants to go into games and ask what major they should do, well, it depends what you want to do in games. But for me, games is about game design. The art of games is game design. That's what, because if you're, it's like with a movie. If you're a director of a movie, then the movie is yours, and everybody else has got skills that you don't have in cinematography and screenwriting and everything, and acting. But the creative vision is yours. And for games, it's the game designer. Some might say the producer for very big projects, but I would always say the lead designer, because they're the ones who are expressing something through the gameplay. And gameplay is where you have to express things in games, because that's all that games have that nothing else has. You have to so it must be where the artistic payload is, because that's all games have that you can't get on television, books, or anywhere else, dance. So whoever creates that artistic payload through the gameplay is the artist, and that's game designers. So if you want to be a game designer, then that's a different question to, I want to work in the game industry. And if you want to be a game designer, the thing to do is, it's not like you want to become one, you just are one. I've been creating games forever.
In your sort of ranking of the gods, you have the lead designers being Zeus, specialist gods being like the Athenas, supernatural beings, demigods, heroes, and everyday folk, which are the NPCs. So that's that. My answer is normally something like, over here at Duke University, they have like public policy analysis, and it's more of a major similar to mine. I'm actually, most people are surprised to hear I'm a history major. I was going to go to law school. Thank God I decided on a different path, and the color of the sky in my world is very different than my law school friends. But the idea of like having these really cross-discipline sorts of majors where you really can bring all these components to bear on the design, that's what I try to urge people towards, because we already have AI doing art. We've got AI writing code now. So one of those decisions is around like, what is going to be the domain of the human in these design environments.
All game designers know a little about a lot. And that's not by accident. It's just because they find everything interesting.
That's
right. And if you want to be a game designer, then you have to have something to say through your game design. You need to be able to say something, and you need to be able to design games. Just have games. If you want to apply for a job as a game designer, just have designed games.
Well, the first thing I would recommend anybody who wants to do this is go read these 2 books at a minimum, and then follow this gentleman as he talks about it online.
Now
thank you very much, Dr. Bartle, for your time today. This has been a rich, wonderful discussion. I look forward to many more. And thank you for those of you who joined us for this edition of the Metaversial Minute.
Goodbye. Thank you. My pleasure.